during those important years from 1961 to 69. At least not until today. It often seems to me that Danish art historians are so busy keeping up an international profile that they omit to record the local art history that they are uniquely placed to study and preserve for cultural history, and which it is their, I think, unique responsibility to take care of, since no international art historians can be expected to do that. But international art historians, spectators and readers may very well be interested in what went on in Aarhus from 1961 to 69 if it's made available to them in terms of internet publications, accessible archives or exhibition catalogues and so on in a language they can read.
Thank you very much. We have quarter of an hour for discussion. Sanja, would you join us? Perhaps also Lars. I think in a way perhaps Lars, your introduction in a way sort of links very nicely between Sanja's presentation and the question of various times, and also the question of how to connect or negotiate between performance and history. As actually is also what is touched upon if you see sort of the way institutional, self-organized, local, ultra-local, national and international networks are collaborating within this period, which is what you highlight. Any comments or questions from, yeah?
Thank you. I have a question to Tania, which is listening at your intro, one gets the feeling that there was no particular social activity in art, certainly in Scandinavia, and it's such a critical time in the recent history. And looking at it, it's sort of almost like little guys that came out together and did a terrific stuff and talked to each other, and that's about it. Whereas, of course, there were a lot of other critical moments at the same time being reenacted in these streets everywhere. And one of the leaders of these enactments came to become in Aarhus. It was a Rudi Dutschke. He was shot in Paris by a fascist and nearly died. And he ended up in Aarhus, which I think is very interesting. Why did he come here? What was going on in Aarhus? Who invited him? And of course he died here. And I wanted to remind everybody that other history.
Yes, you're quite right. I think this is beyond the scope of the Aarhus report that I was talking about. You will not find Dutschke here. If you look, you can see there's certainly feminist implications in Kirsten Justicen's work, which sort of opens towards the feminist movement, which started at that time. And definitely, I think there was, in 1969, I would say there was not much political, it was sort of art politics, but not sort of social politics or political politics going on in Aarhus. But towards the end of the 60s, of course, it gets much more political. And I think there's a lot of what you said about the ground zero situation. That I think that happens perhaps not even in the late 60s, but I think we had to pass on into the 70s, which is also when Duska arrives, of course. So it's slightly outside the time frame of this report, anyway, which is why I wasn't talking about it. But then you get the sort of the radical politics. That also, I think, creates exactly the kind of difficulties you were talking about. You then get a sort of revival of the attempts to create a new man that you find in history, in the political history of Europe, but you also find in the history of the Avantgarde. And you get this focus on impact, which makes it rather difficult, I think in Denmark, it certainly makes it difficult for these artists because they require them to be much more explicit in their political content, much more pedagogical than they were certainly at this period.
Sanja, would you care to comment on that? Or not specifically on teaching?
Denmark and all the Avantgarde. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you just link the pedagogical with the radical. And I think that's something that it seems unfashionable to say. Maybe it's coming back to fashion, but I think it's an interesting connection with prior. How far do you think you can influence people and change them?
Duchka's arrival in Aarhus was very much linked to the students' organizations. Here, he was invited by the Aarhus sort of fraction of the student revolt and lived in a commune in Aarhus as well, and taught at the university. Sort of the interlinkage between perhaps the artistic, social and political avant-garde or movements would also go in this period through the student movements.
Yes. And I think there's a sliding link of connections there. In the early 60s, the students arranged national meetings dealing with arts and experimental art and so on. And these arrangements grew into more and more political activities, fusing art and politics, students' politics, and which developed into the more sort of concerted political actions of the early 70s.
Lars, you looked as if
it was just a question for Tania, because you're here as both a scholar and as a witness to many of the things that are documented in the Aarhus report, having lived here in the 60s. And it struck me that you said towards the end of your presentation that the most local thing about the Aarhus report is actually the fact that it was documented, because these things may not have belonged to Aarhus, or they didn't have their origin here. In that sense, they passed through Aarhus as much as anything. Are you, through your research, aware of any comparable documents, any documents that compare to the Aarhus report, which is a sort of artist-edited publication?
I think it's actually quite characteristic of the 60s that art historians have made very little of them. I think it's really quite astonishing that art historians haven't been doing more about the 60s. I mean, until recently, until my book and another book appeared on the 60s in Copenhagen or in Denmark or generally. I mean, nobody had really written about it, so I think there are lots of artists' archives and writings from this period, because they basically had to do it themselves. They mostly didn't have art historians who were interested in writing about this. The ex-group was fortunate they had their own art historian. And the situation is, the Bauhaus situation is, Jens Thorsen was also an art historian, so he was able to write about it as well as participating in the activities. But if you didn't have a local in-house art historian, you just didn't get recorded. So I think there are probably several others. I can't really think of any just now, but I think that there are probably lots of local things like Aarhus.
I seem to remember that there was a publication in Finland through the Nordic Art Centre, which actually did involve the avant-garde of
Yes.
Scandinavia.
Yes,
And
that's
that would
true.
have been included in the 60s, I think, would appear to be quite comprehensive.
Yes, that's true. Yes, you're right. I think absolutely. The 80s, I think that appeared. Yes.
I wonder, Sanja, if you would care to comment on sort of the connectedness or perhaps the link between what we touched upon between sort of the historical, political performance as compared to sort of artistic or public performance of politics in a way, but in more aesthetic.
I don't know. I was just going to say, just before that, one of the things what struck me was your definition of friendship, just before I go into the performance. That's very much something that's obviously in the revolutionary period, but friends quickly became enemies.
Yes.
In a kind of mysterious way, actually. They didn't realize they were going to become enemies, I think, as quickly as they did. So that's kind of, as a revolution continues, you become self-reflexive about politics because you become self-reflexive about friendships. That's I don't, my only sense, and the reason why I'm motivated to try to do a project like I'm trying to do, is that there's an odd thing happening probably in the last 20 years, is a rapprochement between performance as a general cultural attitude to the past and history that used to be quite clearly demarcated to be the domain of historians. And what I'm quite interested in, you see all these reenactments is everywhere. So in art, in museums, you're supposed to have 3D displays and this kind of affective relation to the past. And what I find interesting is that what you essentially have is an avant-gardiste, if you could say, attitude to the past. You treat the past as if it exists as so many found objects. You can go into an archive and just take whatever you want out of it and reconnect it in any way you want. Network it this way and do it that way. And so the avant-gardism reflects a general performance culture that seems to say something about our contemporary moment. Firstly, and secondly, that the avant-garde is almost posited as an alternate method that can vie with historical methods of dealing with the past. Now, whether we think it's actually viable, I don't know. I mean, some people would say it's very not viable, and that's a problem with our culture today, collapsing all these distinctions. But that's where that's the present day situation, this feeling that we don't know what our milestones are anymore. We throw in chronology out of the window, kind of all of us except historians and the historical department maybe. But so what's going on there with our time? Are we really post-historical? And if we are, what room is there for the avant-garde in that? And do we want to be post-historical? I don't know.
If we have no more comments or questions from the audience, I think Your last remarks here will point very, very well into the presentations after the lunch break on the archive and the unarchival, on the question of perhaps of history and contemporaneity and the avant-gardes. And I think we could take up the discussion exactly on how do we rework or reenact history, connectedness, and perhaps rupture through archives, for instance.
Yeah, and just to say, I think the French Revolution always plays this cusp, right? Where you really aren't supposed to go further back. And what happens when we get rid of milestones? What happens to that kind of milestone? So I think it's still present. We think of modernity as starting after the revolution, not before. So it's a question of historiography, but also a question of where do we count our own beginning? Do we have that concept anymore of our time?
I also very much like your remark during your talk that you could sort of put the milestones in time wherever and see what happens actually if you do that in a more exploratory way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. Are we just, is all history absolutely revisionist and we're all just revising to our own tastes? That would be a negative description of that same thing.
Yeah. I'm not sure we want to be post-historical in that sense. And I think perhaps what's going on is like the interchange between the local and the international. I mean, local art groups, for instance, discover international figures because they're into something like that themselves. They start doing things and then they say, there's someone there who's doing something like what we're doing. And I think perhaps history works in the same way. You know, so that new groups who start some sort of revolutionary process will want to go back and look at, well, what happened in earlier revolutions, and you will then need to, not just to sort of keep reinventing the same things, which have already been invented, you will need then to go into some more specific detail and find out, well, what actually happened at that moment. So I think you will need that kind of tapping into history.
But what's interesting is I think this is what's changing. The generation that did that is a prior generation. So I think for many, many years, many generations went back to the French Revolution. I mean, it's an easy thing to study because everything has been discovered about it because there were subsequent generations interested in knowing how a revolution works. Now, why do we study it? Just because we happen to specialize in that and get a job. You know, there's not a clear sense that there's a motivation anymore. And I think that's the moment when the French Revolution has become really part of the historical past, just for experts only. Whereas before it was something that was very much reactivated by every generation. And they're the ones that did the great work of establishing the archives that we still use nowadays. And I don't think there's any particularly new development there. I don't know.
But perhaps new developments don't come from academia.
Maybe.
But from activists of different kinds. I mean, from Harvard to this.
In relation to what Lars was saying, it's implied that we have a huge choice, which I'm not sure if we do, nor do I think it's a holistic process. I mean, I don't think there is much holistic process between the Israelis style, the goddess Syria and us in Aarhus, you know, but we are actually coexisting together. So it's no longer a process of choices. I don't think we can choose it. It's here.
What's here?
All of it all together, right here in this room. These are separated in a way that is if we can choose it. So,
well, I just wanted to comment on the lack of historicity of contemporary art because I think, I mean, that of course is a lot of people pointing that out, so I don't want to contest that as a general concept, but I think looking at contemporary art, I think a lot of younger artists, and not so younger artists, are very interested in avant-garde practices from the beginning, the later like 60s, 70s practices. So it might not be a historicity in the sense of keeping in order, but I think in diving back into history and what you pointed out, there is this kind of recognition of certain ideas and practices and curiosity of trying to take that somewhere else. So I think there's a lot, I think that's why this is also happening.
Why do you think, because this is a curiosity for me, I'm curious about, what is it? Why do you think that artists nowadays are, it's been quite a while.
Exactly why?
I have an idea that maybe there's a certain, I don't know, but maybe there's a certain nostalgia for a perceived moment when aesthetics and politics were synchronized.
Yeah, but I
don't know why.
There's definitely nostalgia, but I think there's also, particularly in the later 90s, in Danish art scene, also connected internationally, there was this sort of renewed interest in that sort of convergence of political thinking and aesthetic practices, and also a reconsidering of what an artwork can be. So that whole sort of opening up, still to say, the convention of art, and to try to rethink if it can sit differently in society. I think that's a very important. I think it didn't start out with a historical consciousness, but I think that developed towards around 2000 that people started to discover that there is a prehistory of these practices and to look into these practices. So somehow, I think there's. I'm just pointing out that there are many of these practices around, and I think they're not necessarily taking it in the same place. I think there are different ways of rethinking these practices, different ways of applying this practice. I think there's diversity.
I think if I can say something, I think you're definitely right that there may be nostalgia at work here, but motivation is a complex thing. Nostalgia may be one issue, but I think you're also implying a certain naivety on the part of contemporary artists if you're saying, well, they're just looking to a point when politics and aesthetics were synchronized or imagined to be so. So I think the assumption of performance theory of the 1990s, that this was a sort of a pure art form, that it was unsellable, unrepresentable, uninstitutionalized, that it couldn't be institutionalized, etc. I think we are past that, and artists are aware of that as well. But it may have to do with what Tania pointed out, that there are many unwritten histories in this. So there is space for. There's something art historians ought to do, but there's also space for artists to maneuver and to rethink some of these issues that were launched with in the 60s and 70s.
And if one reinterprets the avant-garde by saying actually they were quite within the revolutionary tradition still, so rather than take them as the beginning, take them as the absolute end point of the French Revolution, would that change the way contemporary? Because I'm always struck by their anti-clericalism. The idea is sort of Marianne can go straight to the terror because he has the example of the French Revolution that did it kind of gradually. The recovery of Marquis de Sade, for example. These are all backward-looking, backward-looking things that the historical avant-garde was at the tail end of.
But backward-looking doesn't mean necessarily nostalgic. I mean, you can look back for, and I think that's what people have often done in political as well as in artistic situations. They look back to find examples of how can we do something about the situation. And today it feels like, in the 60s we thought we could change everything. Now, the old society is finished, we'll start something new. Today people seem to think we can't do anything much, I mean, we're just stuck here. whatever we do, nothing will happen. So I think people are perhaps also looking backwards through sort of series of these revolutionary situations, openings, ruptures to see, but well, how did they do it? Is there any inspiration there for us to get going and start to create another situation, a more hopeful
No, I think
situation?
totally with Sanja and take on the reading and rereading of revolutions. At the same time, I think that the revolutionary is in many ways too sort of high octane for the perspective of contemporary artists. That there are very specifically interested in Dave's case, for instance. We talked about Elisitsky yesterday. He said, well, I tend to always go for the prune option when I install my work, so that I sort of articulate my interests. So that's a very specific sort of methodological take on that revolutionary avant-garde.
I'll allow one more comment, and then we'll finish.
One thing that is missing, I think, is the reality of the market and its history in relation to creating products for the market, which actually has involved performance art for a very long time. And I think given the present infiltration of market, corporate values into the museums, etc., is a fundamental, one of the fundamental conditions if we really want to understand what's going on and what has been going on.
Would that be sort of commented on?